Compliment. Somebody tells you you're good looking. Is that a good compliment? Well, you really didn't do anything. Well, maybe you got dressed up nice that day. Maybe you combed your hair the right way. Is that a good compliment? Is a better compliment about your character? Is a better compliment about your qualities? What makes a good compliment? Everybody's been given a backhanded compliment, a compliment that sounds good on the surface, but you look deep down into it and you think, well, is that really something I want to be known for? In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, Paul writes there, "Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me." Useful. Is that a good compliment? You know, you look at the definition in the original language, it really means to be easy to use, which, I don't know, that doesn't sound very good, right? Sounds like something a con man would want. Oh, he's useful, I could use him good. But the context and the idea here is that Mark is someone who's an asset. He's useful. He has a potential to do something. He has the ability to help. He has the potential, the ability, the skill set that will make him a vital part of the ministry. It is the same word that Paul would use for the slave Onesimus when he writes to Philemon in the book of Philemon. In the 11th verse of the book of Philemon, he describes him. He says, "What was formerly useless to you, but is now useful to both you and me." Here he's making a pun on Onesimus' name. Onesimus' name meant, in essence, to be useful. But as a runaway slave, he had become useless, but now he had become useful. In other words, he is something that you wouldn't want, and now he's something that you most definitely want and need. And that's the same word that's used for Mark. You know, someone who is helpful, productive. Maybe somebody we would describe as an asset to the organization. All those words, all those phrases you'd want on your resume, right? You'd want someone who is recommending you to say, this person, he's useful. And most certainly, Mark was useful. We first see Mark being useful in Acts chapter 12 and verse 25, when it talks about Paul and Barnabas, how they had returned from Jerusalem, and they brought with them John, who was also called Mark. As was so common in those days, people had two names they went by each one, depending on who you knew him as. They would call him John, but he was also known as Mark. Mark is the name that we become associated with. But here they take John Mark with them when they go back from Jerusalem, back to Antioch, because they see there's a potential there. And in fact, in Acts chapter 13, when they begin that missionary journey, it says in verse 5, when they reached Salamis, they began to proclaim the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they also had John as their helper. You see, when they decided they were going to go and start spreading the gospel in that first missionary journey, they took John as their helper. The word here in the original language is a unique one. It's a combination word. It takes two words and slams them together to come up with a new idea. The word is hupredes. The two words that it represents are under and rower. The visual there goes back to the Roman ships. You've seen those ships, the Roman ships. They'd have the big sails on top, but they also had a line of oars on the bottom to help them steer and to navigate and to propel themselves. And there would be those who would row those oars. That is exactly what it's talking about here, an under rower. A guy who may not be on the top deck, but who may be in the lower edges, but nonetheless, he's the one providing what is necessary for them to move forward. That's what Mark was. His help is allowing Paul and Barnabas to spread the gospel. This is often used in the New Testament to describe someone who was a servant or a magistrate, specifically those who worked in the temple or those who worked as the person who was taking care of the synagogue. It was the people who are the ones who get things done. Mark was one of those people. He did the grunt work. He took care of the little things. Because of Mark, they were able to fully focus on spreading the good news. Everybody needs someone like Mark. Someone like that is useful to any organization. He was useful, but he was a worker. In Philemon, in verse 24, when he's describing those people, he describes Mark as one of them and calls him a fellow worker. Along with Luke and Demas and Achilles, these are men who were vital in spreading the gospel, and Mark is one of them. He is a fellow worker. It's not just Paul that says good things about Mark. Peter does as well. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, he says that he sends greetings to you, and so does my son Mark. As he is sending greetings to his people, he mentions his son Mark. Now, Peter may literally be talking about his son who was named Mark. But most people believe that who he's talking about here is John Mark. And he's using, like we talked about this morning, Paul did, a son in the faith. John Mark was someone that Peter knew from when he was very young. In Acts chapter 12, when Peter is released from prison, and he escapes prison, the angel appears to him and he heads back. You know where he goes to? He goes to meet where the church is. The church that met there was the one who met in John Mark's house, his mother's house, Mary. But John at that time was a young man living there. And the text tells us that he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. Peter knew Mark from when he was a young boy. And most people look at the Gospel of Mark and see Peter's influence. In fact, one early source calls Mark Peter's interpreter. That Mark's Gospel is very Peter-centric. And it was probably he gained the information from Peter himself. You can see they had a close relationship. Wouldn't you want to be Mark? Useful. A helper, a worker, someone who is like a son to me. But you know what else we talk about Mark for? He was a quitter. In fact, probably the thing that maybe you recognize first about Mark was just that. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 13, we read that though Mark started that first missionary journey as the helper, somewhere along the line it tells them that, it tells us from when he went from Pergamum to Pamphylia, John left them and returned to Jerusalem. We don't know why he left. Maybe he was homesick. Maybe he was tired of being treated as a lackey. Maybe he had an obligation that came up. Whatever it was, Mark leaves. And because of that, we don't know what the reason was, but we do know it was an issue. Because when we get to Acts chapter 15, when Paul and Barnabas are set to go back to the cities that they started in verse 37 it tells us that Barnabas wanted to take John, who was called Mark. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along because he had deserted them in Pamphylia. And he had not gone with them to the work. Paul and Barnabas are saying, okay, we're gonna roll this back and do it again. We're gonna go back to the church as we are. We're gonna try to spread the gospel further. How are we gonna do this? Barnabas says, I think we should take Mark again. Paul says, I don't think so. Last time we took it, he quit. Last time we went somewhere, he didn't finish the job. Now you can kind of see the two men here and the two different perspectives. When you talk about Barnabas, Barnabas was the son of encouragement, right? Barnabas is all about second chances. Barnabas is the guy who went to Saul when everybody thought, I don't know about this guy. He may be just pulling a trick on us. Had he really converted? It was Barnabas that goes to Saul, who we taught is also Paul, and brings him to the apostles, right? He's the one, as we talked about this morning, brings him to Antioch. Barnabas was all about encouragement. Barnabas was all about second chances. But Paul's a little more hard-nosed. Paul is more about sticking to it. Paul is the guy who, it doesn't matter if you beat him, you stone him, you throw him out, you chase him out, he's going to keep on going, right? He has that can-do attitude and that stick-to-itiveness that made him so successful in what he did. So from his perspective, we don't need somebody like Mark. From Barnabas' perspective, we give this young man a second chance. It may have helped. What did we read? John Mark was Barnabas' cousin. You know how it is with family, right? Kind of, if it's, he's my cousin. He's kin to me. We'll do a little more for them. But Paul wasn't about to do that. And this isn't something that's just we're figuring it out. I mean, this becomes a draw a line in the sand moment. In Acts chapter 15, verse 39, it said it occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. Barnabas took Mark and sailed away to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas, left, and committed to the brethren by the grace of God. They had such a sharp disagreement, and the word here is the same word that we would use to talk about something that goads, the thing you use to spur an animal on. That's what the term it uses here. They'd gotten a fight about this. There were words exchanged. So much so, they said, we're not going to work together anymore. All because of Mark. How they perceived him. It's hard when you get a label. When people pigeonhole you into something. Maybe you deserve it. Maybe something you did put you right square where that name tag fits on you. That label sticks. It's hard when you get a label to ever overcome it, though. When people get a certain mindset about you. I always tell people I grew up in a school. We graduated a whole whopping 34 people when I graduated from senior high. And of those 34, there were 16 of us that were there from fourth grade or from fifth grade and down. And there were 13 of us who started in kindergarten together. When half of your class you've been around since you're in kindergarten, I can tell you this, it's hard to get a date. Because every time you go up to one of those girls and say, hey, would you like to go out? They look at you and say, I remember in kindergarten when you used to eat paste. They don't forget it. And you never get over the fact that you were, the biggest goober in kindergarten and first grade and second grade and fourth grade and fifth grade and sixth grade, seventh grade. But still, it's hard to get over that. Mark had a label. He quit. Sometimes it's hard to get over that. But it's obvious that Mark makes a change. But maybe even after he made a change, it stuck to him. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, when Paul writes the church there, he says, Artisius, my fellow prisoner, sends you greetings. Also does Barnabas' cousin Mark, about whom you have received instructions. As he comes to you, welcome him. Have you ever had a line in the text that you really wished you could raise your hand and say, I have additional questions? What did Paul mean here when he says, you've received special instructions about him? Now, this book was written probably about the same time as Philemon. We don't really know. They weren't dated. This is guess that we make. So in Philemon, we know he calls Mark a fellow worker, right? So I don't think necessarily that this is you got to watch out for him kind of instruction. Maybe it was. I figure it's probably, you may have heard some things about Mark. Let me set the record straight. When he comes, welcome him. When he comes, you may have heard some people say, well, I don't know how dedicated he is, or maybe he's, Paul used to say some things about him. I heard that he's the reason Paul and Barnabas broke up. Mark had changed, but it didn't necessarily mean that the label had left him. Sometimes mistakes tend to hang around us. And it's hard to overcome them. The First World War, the spring of 1915, First Lord Admiral of the British Empire needed to open a second front. They needed to divert the Germans from their strength on the Western Front, so they were trying to open a supply line to Russia. If they could capture Constantinople, Istanbul was Constantinople, if you didn't know that, it would change the war effort. So there was an effort to go through an area known as the Gallipoli. They landed soldiers on the beach and began to attack the Turks, but there was a mistake. The defenses were much stronger than were expected, and now troops were stuck on the beach with the guns up in the hills that they couldn't reach, and they were slowly and surely being massacred. They couldn't retreat, because in retreating they'd put themselves in an even more dangerous situation, but the longer they stayed, the more chance that they had of being destroyed. The First Lord Admiral who started this got the nickname the Butcher of Gallipoli. Luckily for him, there was a lieutenant by the name of Charles Monroe. And he came up with a genius plan to get the soldiers out of harm's way. Each night, he would have them sneak off. They would leave dummies and few soldiers by to continue to shoot fire to make it seem like someone was there. They would sneak around to the encampments and light fires and shoot off artillery shells until little by little, almost all the soldiers had been evacuated. Those few that were left as a skeleton troop at the last minute set everything on fire and in the confusion ran for the beach and escaped. And they were able to pull out the forces without any loss of an additional life. But the defeat stuck to the Lord Admiral. You can imagine how difficult his career would become. For many people, he should never be given a command again. But luckily for us, he learned something from that. Because that Lord Admiral was Winston Churchill. Years later, Winston Churchill would be quoted as saying, "I should have made nothing if I had not made mistakes." Every person makes mistakes. The question is, do we give up? Do we let someone else thinking that we're not going to be useful make it so, even though it might not be the case? Even when our mistakes haunt us, even when it's difficult to overcome, do we keep pressing forward? Or do we allow ourselves to be useless, even when we have something left to offer? In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 20 and 21, we read, "Now in the large house there are not only gold and silver vessels, but also vessels of wood and earthenware, some to honor and some to dishonor. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from these things, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful to the master, prepared for every good work." In every house, in every organization, in every life, there are some shining moments, and there are some that aren't so great. There's some victories, and there's some defeats. There are times when we did the right thing, and then there's times when we don't. Do we let those things define us? If anyone cleanses himself, to cleanse oneself, you have to recognize what you did. You have to recognize the need for change. You have to recognize that there may have been a better way. For Mark to become useful, he had to overcome whatever it was that had made him not so useful. He had to live down the reputation. He had to prove himself. But if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he can become something more. Sometimes we may not find ourselves very useful because we've never looked to see if maybe there's something we can do better. But if we cleanse ourselves, we can be made into something better, a vessel for honor. What you were isn't what you have to be. Labels They may get stuck to us, but you know you can peel those things off. Sometimes we get hit with that label, right? Hello, I'm a whatever. Hello, I'm a failure. Hello, I am not reliable. Hello, I am whatever we get labeled. But you know we can peel those things off and make a change. If we cleanse ourselves, we can write over what used to be there and put something better, something honor, something sanctified, something useful to the master. Notice he says, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. It would have been easy to look at Mark and write him off. Paul was ready to do it. Maybe that's exactly what he needed. Maybe Mark had been kind of coddled for his life, and he needed a wake-up call. But it would have been easy to just dismiss him. It would have been easy for him to say, well, he doesn't want me. I guess I'm just not any good. But if we recognize and see what we can be, and we prepare ourselves to do just that, we can become useful. All he needed was a second chance. All he needed was another opportunity. We live in a world today that is quick to cancel people. It's quick to look at someone's mistake, to find something in their past that they did wrong, said wrong, acted wrong, and to define them by that. We don't want to give credence to what they did, so we have to write them off, we have to exclude them, we have to cancel them, we have to throw them away. But that hadn't just been happening recently. That's what we do with a lot of folks. That's even what we do with ourselves. But what if we did that with some of the great heroes of the Bible? Go back and look at the lives of so many of those men of faith, and you'll see they didn't always get it right. They pulled some major mistakes. They did some things that no one should ever be proud of. But they overcame. They kept going. They may have proved themselves to be useless, but they became useful for the Lord because they didn't quit. Mark may have quit, but he wasn't a quitter. And you don't need to be either. You may find yourself and think, well, I've done too much. God can't use me. But God can't use you only if you won't let Him. Let's understand that what we think might not be useful, God can make into something useful. That goes for me, and that goes for you as well. We just need to make sure we're walking in the right path. Are you on the path that leads to heaven today? Are you doing the things that God has commanded you to do? Maybe you've started on that journey, but you got a little off track. And you may think there's no hope for me. But there's always hope because there's Jesus Christ. And no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, you can be useful to the Master. If you'll recognize what you did, cleanse yourself from the former things, change your life, and start walking towards Him, He can make something useful. Today, if you need to respond to the invitation we offer to you right now while we stand and sing.
When we walk with the Lord in the light